and welcome to another episode in my podcast, One Woman is Twice Two Soldiers. I am your hostess, Caitlin, and on this podcast we explore things like historic myths, dresses, wardrobes, basically anything that's clothing and fiber related to the historic time period. I focus mostly on the 19th century, and occasionally we delve into 20th century stuff as well. If any of that sounds interesting to you, make sure you just go ahead and subscribe so you're notified anytime a new episode is published. So last time we discussed Victorian dressmakers and how they practiced their craft, and this time we're going to dive into naturally dyeing cloth, as was told dyeing manual, specifically one particular manual that we're going to look at a lot today. I did a myth busting video on YouTube last week, and typically I just rehash the same thing over again for the podcast, but I decided I didn't want to do the thing twice. If you'd like to listen to the myth busting video, I will link that below. But otherwise, we're going to pick a certain topic from the myth busting video instead of doing the whole thing again and really dive in deep. And so specifically the first myth that we looked at in that video was a myth that they didn't have bright colors back then. And so I'm going to hone in on that and talk about dyeing in the 19th century and how to get the different colors using an 1815 dyeing manual. So buckle up for a chemistry lesson because we're about to talk about all sorts of chemicals. Without further ado, let's get started. Also, if you're watching and not just listening, I'm going to be looking a lot at my screen. I do apologize. I want to make sure I get this information correct, and I am doing a lot of quoting for this video. So I'm not going to be looking at the camera as much. If you're listening, you don't get to deal with any of that, so lucky you. So let's start by rehashing the concept of protein fibers versus cellulose fibers. If you're not familiar with those terms, that is okay. I will explain it here. A protein fiber comes from a living being, such as human hair is a protein fiber. Protein fibers include wool from other animals such as sheep or alpaca. It also includes silk, or the fibers of the cocoon of certain worms called silkworms. Any fur, hair, wool, or otherwise animal-based fiber such as a leather or a feather is going to be a protein fiber. Other examples would be llama or Angora goats or rabbit fur, although those fibers don't pop up in the 19th century like sheep wool or alpaca. Cellulose fibers, or plant-based fibers, are just that, they're plant-based. Cotton is a cellulose fiber. It is the fruit, or at least the seed pod, of the cotton plant. Linen comes from flax, which is a weed-like fiber with beautiful purplish blue flowers that, through a lot of thrashing and whacking, etc., becomes very fibrous and can be spun into linen thread. Another cellulose fiber that occasionally gets used in the 19th century was piña cloth, or cloth made from the leaves of the pineapple plant, which is very hard to get nowadays outside the Philippines. Today, other cellulose fibers include things like the banana fiber and also some synthetically modified, naturally based fibers such as rayon. So basically, natural fibers come from living things. Plant-based or cellulose fibers come from things that photosynthesize, and all other protein fibers come from critters that are further up the food chain. So the fun thing and the most important thing to note is that protein fibers will take on a better color than cellulose fibers most of the time. So you will get a brighter, deeper, more saturated hue, and it's easier to do so with a silk or a wool as opposed to a cotton or a linen. And this was a no problem in the 19th century as well. In Volume 6 of the Repository of Arts, Manufactures, and Agriculture, published in 1810, it says, "Linen and cotton, as vegetable substances, have the defect of not taking colors with solidarity. The cause resides in their resinous principle, which we must endeavor to remove from them," end quote. So we're going to start off with some preliminary remarks from a practical treatise on dyeing and calico printing by Thomas Cooper in 1815. We're actually going to be following this book quite a bit for much of today's episode. Quote, "On the subject of the arts of dyeing are wool, silk, cotton, linen, or leather. The staining of ivory, bone, horn, or wood, or the tingeing of glass or enamels are not comprehended under dyeing. The present treatise relates wool, silk, and cotton," end quote. It does go on to explain that the dyeing process is basically where you fix one color to a substance. Sometimes that action, such as with indigo or woad, the effect is immediate, and other times, like with most dyes, the dye cannot be fixed without an intervention of some other substance called a mordant. Common mordants are going to be alum, tin, iron, or copper. It also explains the very basics of dyeing, such as if you want a very light or delicate color, you ought to use a dye bath that has been used at least twice. It also states that the author has found that just under boiling temperature, so like 180 to 190 degrees Fahrenheit, is better in most cases. Personally, I find that cotton and linen dye better when they are boiled as opposed to wool and silk, which do not in my experience. Something very interesting that I read in the same book was that there were attempts to add animal proteins to cotton cloth as an attempt to get it to dye more vibrantly. Apparently, if you use sheep or cow dung to help mordant your fabric, you can get a turkey red on cotton. And I'm not entirely sure I'm willing to try that yet, but I do get random moods where I'm like, that thing I read about, yeah, I'm going to try that today. And so I feel like this is going to be one of those things. I'm just going to wake up one day and go, I'm going to harvest cow poop today to make cotton bright red. Also, I'm not an authentic dyer because I'm a color-happy chaos goblin, and I throw things in hot pots and see what happens. And the treatise specifically states to not do anything except by weight and measure, so I don't pass that test. The next section of the book just lists a bunch of dyes and where they grow, but does not talk about how to use them or what color they give, so I'm going to mostly skip that part and get to the practical part. I won't always give quantities. As Mr. Cooper is writing, he doesn't always give quantities, and when he does, he often gives really, really large quantities. Because he's talking about huge dye houses and the numbers are astronomical. But where I can, I will list things either in parts if the author gives them in parts. And if you don't know how to read a recipe with parts, it's really quite simple. So let's say a recipe is 1 part flour, 1 part sugar, 1 part butter, 1 part water. That means I could use 1 cup flour, 1 cup sugar, 1 cup butter, 1 cup water. Or I can say my part is a pound. So I can do 1 pound of each ingredient. Or I can say that each part is a teaspoon and do 1 teaspoon of each ingredient. That's how parts work. You choose the unit of measure and then just keep the ratios right. And I hope that made some semblance of sense. For most of the book, he does give quantities of dyes and mordants and relative to each pound of fiber to be dyed. So let's say if I use 2 ounces of such and such and such and such, I know that is per pound of fiber. And when I say I'm highly summarizing this book, yes, I know this video is very lengthy. I'm only giving you a very small sliver of information on the way to dyes. I'm going to give you 2 or 3 recipes per color when there are literally dozens of like all the shades. So if you're extremely interested, the book will be linked below for you to read at your convenience. The first fiber we're going to get to is how to dye wool. It does specifically state that it is easier to dye wool when it is still in the wool. And today is not the day where we go into how to process wool to be dyed. That's a whole nother video, so we're going to get straight into the actual dyeing portion. So I'm going to rearrange the order that the book gives the colors just to be the same for each fiber, just for clarity's sake. We're going to start with the colors of the rainbow, so red, orange, yellow, green, blue, and violet. We're going to skip indigo, it's the same as blue basically. And then we're going to do pink, brown, gray, and black. So beginning with red on wool, there are several ways mentioned in the book about dyeing wools red. The first 2 methods include chemical compounds, which you can no longer get over the counter, at least here in America, so I opted not to look too far into those. Here's a different method that includes at least ingredients you can get today. So for every 112 pounds of wool, have a pot of warm water in which you've added 6 3/4 pounds of cream of tartar. Add in half a pound of cochineal, which is a parasitic bug that lives on a cactus. That's going to be well ground. You're going to grind that up really well. Stir it in, then add 5.5 pounds of tin chloride and stir again. When it's about to boil, you're going to add in your wool. Turn it in the boiling dye pot for 2 hours. Take it out, air it, wash it in the river. You're going to empty your pot, add more water to boiling point, add 5.5 pounds of ground and sifted cochineal. Then add 15 1/4 pounds of tin chloride. Mix that very well before adding your cloth, rinsing it 3 to 4 times rapidly and then slowly to make sure the whole of the cloth is under the liquid. Boil it for an hour before taking it out, airing it, washing it, and drying it. If more of a flame red is required as opposed to a crimson, you can add some turmeric to that first set of dye. Remember, you had to dye it twice, so add turmeric to the first set. If you want a more of a pomegranate red, you're going to add fustic bark. Fustic is a tropical hardwood that grows from Mexico to Argentina. And you're going to add that to the cochineal bath after it's almost spent, which means all the dye is almost gone from the pot. Or at least that you've used it once or twice already. If you add a little bit of madder to this fustic and cochineal dye bath, you can get like a rose color or a cherry red. An even easier crimson dye bath involves boiling the wool in cream of tartar and alum, then rinsing the wool before adding it to the pot of boiling water in which you have put an ounce of ground and sifted cochineal for each pound of wool. And you're going to boil that for an hour and a half. Orange. If you do the bath as you did for cochineal and you just add more fustic to it, you're going to get more fustic to that pomegranate bath. You're going to get more of an orange or a gold color. You can add turmeric to this cochineal bath to get more orange as well. Orange is a secondary color, so really by mixing any red and yellow dye, you're likely to get some shade of orange. Add cochineal for like a darker shade. The book does state that red should be dyed first, then over dyed with yellow. So that's not just, typically adding red dye and yellow dye to the same pot. You're going to dye red first, which is the darker color, and then put it into another dye pot with the yellow to over dye it, and that's how you get a lot of those colors. Personally, I have found an orange does really well if you have alum and you soak the wool in alum water and you take it out and put it into a madder dye pot. I've gotten some really good oranges from that. And there are a lot of ways to get yellow: turmeric, fustic, weld, goldenrod, fenugreek, among many, many others. The author says that you have weld, fustic, and this is going to be a fun one to pronounce, quercentron, you can get just about any shade that you want. If you can't get weld, goldenrod is a very close shade. You're going to add 4 ounces of alum and 1 ounce of cream of tartar to water. Boil it for an hour and a half with the wool. That's your mordant. Drain it, rinse it, then add 5 pounds of weld per pound of cloth to boiling water and boil until the dye is spent, which means the dye is all gone. For a lighter yellow, use half the ingredients. For fustic, take the wood chips or shavings, put them in a linen bag, and then boil it for 3 hours before the wool is put in so that the dye will go into the water pot. Now for green. For a Saxon green, which is, in my opinion, very similar to a bluish grayish sage green, put in 2 ounces of alum, 1 ounce of indigo, 4 ounces of fustic wood, and boil the wool for 2 or 3 hours. Wash the wool very well afterwards. I imagine the same would work for osage instead of fustic. I live in Texas where osage grows naturally and it's a great dye tree that gives yellow, and I can get that locally. If you want to turn your Saxon green into a bottle green, you need to dip it into a black vat next to darken the color. I have gotten a very good dark green from putting my wool into an indigo vat first for no more than 10 minutes before putting it into a osage pot and boiling it. If you wanted an apple green, do the Saxon green and repeat the process with 1/3 of the ingredients. And don't boil it at first, keep it cold, keep the wool in until the heat approaches boiling before you take out the wool. With blue, Fursley, pastel, and woad are mentioned. They're basically the same plant, but pastel is the garden version and woad is the wild field version. And they're not used much in America. With the introduction of indigo, they're widely used in Europe though. And there are many processes on that. I'm not going to talk more about woad because that's, again, not something that I do here in America. But if you're interested in that, they do have several pages on woad dyeing, and so you can go look that up as well. And the book does say that indigo dyes better than woad does, so it says that 5 pounds of indigo will dye as much wool as 200 pounds of woad. The first way to get an indigo vat, there's lots of ways to get indigo vat, and I'll just tell you several of them throughout this whole video. The first way is with a bran and madder vat. The indigo is ground into a very fine paste, which is passed through a fine sieve to make sure that there are no lumps. The vat, which is copper on the bottom, should have boiling water, 2 parts bran, 1 part madder, and 2 parts potash, which is like a potassium salt-ish thing that's water soluble, and that has been previously dissolved in hot water. And then you can add some lime to the potash if you want. The indigo, which should be 2 parts, is introduced into the vat as a fine powder, and then you fill the vat with water to bring it just under boiling point and allow the whole to settle for 10 hours. After that time, the vat is raked, allowed to sit, raked again, and when the froth is blue and puts on a dark green color with like a coppery tint, that's when it's ready for dyeing. When you dye with indigo, the cloth's going to take on a green or teal color, and it's only going to turn blue once it hits air, and sometimes it takes a few minutes. The book suggests dipping the cloth a second time to improve the color, and the color will be improved further if you add in a little bit of powdered woad to the vat. For a navy blue, you're going to need 20 ounces of green copperas, also known as ferrous sulfate, and I'm going to butcher all of these chemical names, and I will apologize ahead of time. Most of the time I'm going to use the modern chemical names. The first time I introduce it, I will use a period name as well, just for clarity's sake. But anyway, you're going to need 20 ounces of green copperas, which is the ferrous sulfate, and then 4 ounces of blue copperas, which is copper sulfate. And I'm going to, again, use their modern names from now on, just for clarity's sake. But if you know your period dye names, I kept the reference here. So you'll dissolve those into a copper pot with water, then put your cloth in for an hour and a half, let it drip dry, then move on to part 2, which is scalding 6 pounds of logwood in 3 hours in water. Put in your cloth, leave it to boil for 45 minutes, take it out, drain it, and dry it. Now part 3, put it back in your copper mixture for 45 more minutes. You need to repeat those steps of copper, logwood, until you reach your desired shade. Please note that this book says it is a cheap color. It will not stand much wear or washing. Now it's time for purple, or as our little book calls it, red mixed with blue colors. For this, it's best to start with blue fabric, then over dye the second part with cochineal dye. So the darker the shade of blue and red, the darker your purple. For violet, you're going to use a blue vat ground, mordant with alum, and then dye it with 1/2 ounce of cochineal per pound of wool. For a light violet, use a white wool, but make a cochineal bath with 1/2 ounce of cochineal per pound of wool, and then add 2 ounces of bismuth to the dye bath. And now for pink. I have personally found that wool soaked in alum, dissolved water, and then put in a pot of water, which you have boiled, ground cochineal, will yield a lovely fuchsia color. I guess gorgeous. If you're looking for more of a true pink, 4 pounds of safflower may be used per pound of wool, but the wool must be as white as possible. And using safflowers to dye is a very labor-intensive process, that I will go through here. So put the safflowers into a linen bag and put that in a river and stomp on it for 4 to 5 hours. It will take most of the day until all the yellow is washed away, because safflower has a yellow dye and also a pink dye. The yellow dye is water soluble. You have to get rid of that to get to the pink dye. So then after the 4 or 5 hours, when all the yellow has washed away, you're going to take 1/2 pound of potassium carbonate and dissolve it into a little bit of hot water, and when it is lukewarm, pour it onto the safflower and let it sit for 2 or 3 hours. Then you're going to add 1/2 pint of lemon juice. You can use really any acid, but it does say lemon juice does give the best color, even though it is the most expensive back then. And your dye should be kept at 60 to 90 degrees Fahrenheit. Add your wool and stir it until all the dye is in the wool and your dye bath is colorless. If the wool is not dark enough, you're going to repeat the whole process with more safflowers. Browns are very easy to get, but a few notes on brown woolens. You can get brownish grays if you use copperas with galls, sumac, alderbark, or white oak bark. If you do a gray dye of copperas and logwood, you can add in some yellow dye to make it more brown as well. Walnut hulls are another great way to get brown, and it involves a very long process of boiling and almost fermenting the walnut hulls. It takes months. And now for black. There are lots of ways to dye cloth black. Most were not color fast, meaning that they would bleed if they got wet, or they would just crock off on furniture or the people that came into contact with the fabric. The process usually starts with blue cloth, not white cloth. So go back up to the blue section and get your indigo vat ready and dye that before you get to your black. So after you have your blue wool, you're going to then take 18 pounds each of logwood and powdered nut galls and boil them in water for 12 hours. You're going to take out 1/3 of that liquid, put it into another boiler with 1 kilogram of verdigris, or the green stuff that happens when copper oxidates. So like the Statue of Liberty is all green, even though it's copper. It's like verdigris stuff, and it's mildly toxic to handle, so be careful. As with several of the other chemicals we talk about today, this is not a kid project. A lot of these are toxic, or sometimes very much so. So just, if you're going to do any of this, make sure you know what you're doing. Make sure you have the proper safety measures in place. Just be careful. You're going to take 18 pounds of each of the logwood and the powdered nut galls, and you're going to boil them for 12 hours. So you'll scald the cloth in that for 2 hours, and then for part 2, you take another 1/3 of that nut gall and logwood stuff into the second boiler. You're going to add 9 pounds of ferrous sulfate, which again is green copperas in the period. Let that dissolve on low heat, and then you're put in the cloth for 1 hour before taking it out and letting it cool. Now part 3, you're going to take the last 1/3 of that nut gall and logwood mixture into the second boiler. You're going to add in 20 pounds of sumac, boil it for 15 minutes, throw in 2.5 more pounds of ferrous sulfate, and then let that dissolve. Let the liquid cool for a little bit, and then you're going to add cloth for at least 1 hour, at which point you rinse it, air it, and then put it back in the pot to boil, or just under a boil, for 1 hour. Then you're going to wash it in the stream until the water runs clear. Then you'll take a liquid of weld, boiled it for a few minutes, then cool it, and you're going to, at which point you'll add the cloth, let it sit for 1 hour, drain it, air it, then wash it again until the water runs clear. Congratulations, you now have black cloth. This produces a nice velvety black. Other lesser blacks may be obtained in other ways that aren't nearly so labor intensive, But if you want that pretty black, apparently you have to work for it. If you want gray, using an older black dye vat can render a gray or a brown. It kind of depends on the vat. For silks, I have personally found that silk can be very fragile when wet. You want to have a very large dye bath so that the silk can move freely. Otherwise, you might find wrinkles that will not come out or an uneven dye job. Silk fibers come from the cocoon of the domestic silk moth, while in chrysalis, the whole is boiled until the moth is dissolved. The moth may not be allowed to break free of its chrysalis because that breaks the fiber and causes interior silk. So for time's sake, I'm not going to go into the process of creating silk. At one point, I do have it on my list of things to do one day, to buy silkworms and make my own silk, and that will be an episode at some point. Most of the processes for wool will also work for silk because it's, again, a protein fiber, and I'll list a few more examples for you. Other than cochineal, red may be achieved by first dyeing the silk with annatto in a process I'll explain when we get to the orange color. Then you'll set the silk into a cold alum bath for 12 hours. Should you want more of a maroon or a cinnamon color, or even a wine color, you'll make a dye bath of fustic, another of logwood, and another of Brazil wood. Take 1 part fustic, 1/4 part Brazil wood, and 1/18 part logwood. Boil your silk in this, and you should have more of a cinnamon color. For maroon, add more logwood. If you want to use cochineal for silk, mort it with alum, and then dye the same way for wool with the tin chloride mordant as well. For orange, annatto, again, is an excellent plant to use. 4 ounces of that with 4 ounces of potash per pound of silk. Put the whole in a boiler of soft water, and it will make a true orange. If you want more of a redder orange, add vinegar or cream of tartar to the dye bath. For even a redder orange, you can achieve that with old baths of Brazil wood or safflower. If you do the same annatto bath, but then you add in tin chloride to the mix, you can get a lemon yellow. So I have found that Osage gives a very good orange, but if you use the dye bath a second time, you can get a very nice dark yellow on silk. I mordant that with alum. For another yellow, you can mordant the silk with alum, then you rinse it, put it in a dye pot with Brazil wood. Then at the later stages of the dyeing process, add a little bit of vinegar to change it from red to yellow. Now for greens. So you're going to begin by dyeing your silk blue with indigo, as was described a few minutes ago. I have personally found that blue overdyed with yellow makes a better green than yellow overdyed with blue, and it appears like the book agrees with me. So you're going to take a dye bath of weld to give a lemon yellow color, and then dip the silk in to get the required shade. By varying how deep your blues and yellows and how long you leave it in the yellow pot, it's going to determine the shade of green that you get. If you want a very dark green, the book says to use weld pot that's nearly exhausted and to add a little bit of logwood liquid and add some fustic as well. For a sea green, after being dipped in indigo, mordant with alum, and then put it in a very strong weld pot. And when the weld is exhausted, you add fustic or annatto, and then if you need it even darker, you add a little bit of logwood. For a meadow or an emerald green, the process is the same, but the silk should be rinsed between mordanting and then putting it into the weld pot. To dye silk blue, a vat must be made. Indigo silk vats are made like sugar loaves, and the short end is put into the ground. You want it where the fire is at ground level, will not burn the sediment that's on the bottom of the vat. The vat is created with indigo, potash, indigo, and bran. The vat is made the same way, but apparently has a tendency to blacken and not produce a good color. And they are of the opinion that lime damages silks, so it should not be added. Mr. Cooper, who writes the treatise, argues that some time cannot damage silk, and that the same vat used for wool should also work for silk. If you want a Saxon blue, which is a common dullish greenish blue in the later 18th century, the most common method used for silk that can also be used for wools is thus, and it does use sulfuric acid, so this is not an at-home project unless you really know how to handle dangerous chemicals. But have the fiber sitting in a mordant of alum and cream of tartar, 3 ounces of alum and 1 ounce of tartar per pound of fiber. The dye should be prepared with 6 pounds of vitriol of oil, also known today as sulfuric acid, and 1 pound of indigo, which has been finely ground, washed through a sieve, then dried again. After dyeing, make sure to fully wash the cloth so that no acid remains. The true crime consumer in me wonders if the cloth, if it was not rinsed and the acid was left, would it actually cause harm to the person wearing the garment, although I suppose the dressmaker would find out first. For blue, prepare an indigo vat, again, in the same way as described for wool, but instead of allowing the goods to soak in the vat, it does say to leave the silk in for no more than 1.5 minutes at a time, and allowing it to air each time before re-dipping it to get a darker shade. For king's blue or turkey blue, to the darkest blue shades, it's recommended that you use silk that was previously dyed with argil, which is like a type of lichen. Violet is given with a bath of logwood and verdigris. And verdigris, I don't know if the synthetic verdigris that you can buy today would work just as well. I really have no idea. In hot water, put in 1 ounce of verdigris per pound of silk and allow it to cool. The silk is put in, allowed to sit for an hour or two, then it is taken out and wrung out. Then it says to make a decoction of logwood, but does not say how much, but then you dye the silk into it. Then you take out the silk, put in alum water or vinegar, and that will redden it with the logwood blue dye to make purple. For pink, you're going to do the same safflower process that you did with the wool, right down to stomping it in the river for 4 to 5 hours and adding the lemon juice. The book also states that barring safflower, the cheapest way to get pink would be likely to use peach wood. For a fuchsia, I would imagine my method of dyeing wool, that shade, would also work for silk, as again, silk dyes very similarly to wool. The book says the best way to procure black on silk is to use a hatter's dye, and a recipe is included. The ingredients are sumac and any of the following: fustic, oak bark, alder bark, walnut peel, or walnut bark. Boil the chosen 2 ingredients for 3 hours at least before putting in your silk at a scalding heat, stirring for 2 hours before taking it out and allowing it to cool. Add ferrous sulfate to the dye bath and put the silk back in for an hour, take it out, air it, and repeat the process 2 more times. After the 3rd time, add in a bucket full of logwood dye, that is logwood chips that are in a linen bag, and you boil it in water for 3-ish hours, and that kind of creates a logwood liquid that you can add to other dye baths. And a little bit of blue vitriol or copper sulfate, and you're going to add a little bit of blue vitriol or copper sulfate, and then put the silk back in for a final time before allowing it to dry. Now for cottons. For cottons, the book reiterates that the plant-based fibers take on colors differently and less brilliantly than wools. It says if you were to take linsey woolsies or a mixed fiber in wool cloth and dye it for the wool directions, the wool will take the color, but the cotton or linen will nearly be white. It also states that you're going to need more dye per pound of cotton than you do for wool. The book also says the best mordant for cotton is acetate of aluminum. I looked this up. To make this, you need to get 1 1/4 pounds of sugar of lead, which is lead acetate, and you're going to add in 1 pound of alum. Again, I only recommend all this if you know what you're doing and know how to handle chemicals. For those processing their own cotton, the book does state that loosely woven cotton or loosely spun cotton takes dye better than the tightly spun. I'm betting a better book would have better directions on red dye, as this book does specifically say that crimson red is seldom dyed on cotton. I'm going to list the prep work parts because the dyeing method is basically the same as wool, but to get a cotton to take the color, you had to add in animal proteins to it, which does make sense since we're using the process for wool. So after mordant your cotton in alum water for 1.5 hours, you're going to take fresh blood from an unspecified animal. I doubt it matters which kind, I guess just whatever blood you have on hand. And you're going to dilute it with water and heat it to 110 degrees Fahrenheit. Keep the cotton in for 1 hour before taking it out, draining the pot and rinsing it. Then you're going to dye it with 1 ounce of quicentron per pound of cotton, and again, drain it, wash it, dry it. Then you get to do your cochineal bath. Other false reds can be produced with Brazil wood, and you can do that after you've done the blood part of preparing the cloth. Now I have 2 thoughts on this. One, do I have any early 19th century cottons that are red? Because I have new thoughts about housing them with my other garments, but no, all my reds are silks or wools. My second thought was, dang, I wish I read this 3 days ago when that deer was hit on the side of the road next to the house. I could have drained the body. I have the cochineal, and part of me really wants to see if this works. But I don't keep quercitron right now, so the blood wouldn't stay fresh very long. So I guess it all worked out in the end. The only method for dyeing orange in the book was to dye the cloth crimson with a tin mordant and then dye with Brazil wood with a little bit of cochineal and then run it again through the same mordant and over dye with 2 ounces of quercentron to each pound of cotton. A cinnamon red may be produced by dyeing the cotton with 2 parts of alum, 1/2 part blue vitriol, again called copper sulfate, and either 1/2 pound of weld or 3 or 4 ounces of quercentron. Then refresh the dye bath with 2 ounces of alum per part, heat for an hour, then dye with 2 ounces of gall and 14 ounces of madder to the pound of cotton. Specifically for yellow, the book warns that the cloth needs to be more than half bleached for the color to look nice, because it makes sense, it's a lighter color. For a mordant, per pound of cotton, mix 4 ounces of alum and 1/2 ounce of blue vitriol, or again, copper sulfate, and boil the cloth for an hour and let it remain in the pot until cool. You're going to wring it out. And our very favorite author, Mr. Thomas Cooper, who at this point is convinced, I'm convinced, wrote this entire book just to parade the process of incorporating animal proteins into cotton dyes and get everyone to use it, now says to make a sheep's dung liqueur by using a pint of dung, 1/2 ounce of potassium carbonate at 120 degrees to keep the cloth in it before wringing it out. You'll let this stay moist in its wrung out state for 24 hours. Now you'll prepare the dye bath with 1.25 pounds of weld and 2 ounces of quercentron per pound of cotton by boiling for 2.5 hours, and take out the weld and then strain it all. Put the cotton back in while the liquid is warm, bring it up to a scald until the color is exhausted or the shade that you want is reached. You can change the shade of yellow by omitting the copper sulfate or the ferrous sulfate, or by diminishing the alum and adding potassium carbonate. You can also use turmeric to dye yellow, and if you are in a place where osage trees grow like I am, a very pretty sunshine yellow can be produced by osage shavings when the cotton is mordanted with alum. For a fast screen, I do an indigo blue mordanted with alum and then dye it with weld or quercentron. For a fall screen, mordant with 1 ounce of alum to 2 ounces of blue copperas with 2 ounces of copper sulfate, and dye with 4 ounces of fustic and 12 ounces of logwood. For a bottle green, you're going to do the same as for fall screen, except for this time do the fustic and the sumac in 2 equal parts and add a little bit of ferrous sulfate. To dye a cotton or linen blue, the indigo vat previously discussed in the wool section can be used. I myself have used indigo to great effect with cotton, although I use different chemicals in my indigo vat, and I use a much smaller vat. Mr. Cooper lists at least 10 other manners of dyeing cotton with indigo, including the French, English, German, and Swedish methods for those who are interested. For I myself, I don't see why I would have different vats for all different fibers when one vat may be used for all of the fibers. If you wish to dye a very light blue called China blue, the method is 12 parts indigo, 12 parts lime, 10 parts green copperas, 4 parts iron liquid. Now the vat I have used is most similar to the English method of dyeing calico with indigo, and it's 1 part indigo, 2 parts green copperas or ferrous sulfate, and 2.5 parts lime. Again, that's most similar to what I did, is that I did 3 parts lime, 2 parts ferrous sulfate, and 1 part indigo. So I only differed in adding an extra 1/2 part of lime to mine. And next time I'm going to add the 2.5 parts lime and just see if that makes a difference. When I have made my smaller vats, I put it into plastic totes and have actually bothered measuring. I used a unit of 50 grams. So I did 50 grams of indigo, 100 grams of ferrous sulfate, and 150 grams of lime. There are 2 methods of getting violet. It says one is not color fast, so I'm only going to write out the other method. Mordant the cloth with iron liqueur, to which has been added alum and copper sulfate, then dyed with logwood and over dyed with madder or Brazil wood. No blood is mentioned in the preparation of these dye baths. For purple specifically, do a tin mordant and dye with logwood and Brazil wood, adding half an ounce of verdigris per pound of cotton. Now for pink, and not much is mentioned, which surprises me because I see a lot of pink cottons for children's wear in the early and mid-19th century. It says first to dye it black with paste work, and then dye it with safflower, and then a solution of cream of tartar or lemon juice if you can afford it. But it does say this color is not color fast and will not stand washing or exposure to sun. I think a later book would probably give us more information, but we don't have time today, so that's going to be a later video. I know there are so many places to get dye book information. I mean, you can look it up online. Sometimes I'll do things like dye and then cotton, and I'll do prints, and I'll just kind of sift through the results and see what I can find. Godey's Ladies Book or Peterson's Magazine, other ladies' magazines will sometimes have how to dye colors within their issues. It's not like a standard thing that they do, but occasionally you'll come across recipes for dyeing. And you can just find things like that all over the place. But yeah, it does very much surprise me that there isn't a lot of information in this book on dyeing cotton pink. Because again, I see it all over the place, especially with children's clothes. Now to get browns on cotton, the book says to make a red dye bath, but to mordant the cloth with both iron and alum. For drabs, mordant 2 ounces of alum and 2 ounces of ferrous sulfate, and then dye with half a pound each of fustic and sumac. Mr. Cooper would like to remind you that the color will be deepened if between the mordant and the dye, if you run the cloth through heated dung water. And I'm sure we all very much appreciate that reminder. Black on cotton is especially tricky and was well known in the period for crocking off. In fact, in a story we're going to talk about with our next episode on dressmaking, we're going to look into the 1840s Godey's Book of Lydia Leeson, where her father, being a doctor, is called out to examine an infant of a recently widowed woman because her infant's arm was turning black, and the mother called it mortifying, and she thought they were going to have to saw off the child's arm. Turns out the widowed woman had recently dyed her cotton wrapper black, and the black dye, when she was holding her infant, was crocking off on the baby's arm, and it freaked her out, and she couldn't put two and two together to realize it was her fabric that was, it was the dye of the fabric that was crocking off on the baby's arm. So the first method to dye cotton black, according to the book, is to take any old iron and put it into a vat of cider vinegar for 3 months. That's your iron liqueur, which I know we've mentioned before, so if you wanted to know what that was, that's what that is. Boil it for an hour and a half, 2 ounces of gall, 4 ounces each of sumac and alder bark, and then put in your cotton that has been previously dyed a light indigo, and work it in that dye pot for an hour or more at scalding heat. And then take the cotton out, put it in a tub, and then pour enough of the dye just to cover it, and then let it sit for several hours. Then you'll drain it and wring out the cloth, but do not dry it. Stir it in the pot of your iron liqueur at 120 degrees Fahrenheit for an hour. Drain it, air it, and then rinse it in water. Oh, you thought you were done? No, we're not even halfway through with our steps. Now you take your first dye pot. Remember that you left some of the dye in there, and you're going to add to it 1 ounce of madder and 1 ounce of quinacridone per pound of cotton, and then bring it back up to a heat of 170 degrees. Work the cotton in this bath for an hour, then drain it and wring it. The next step is to take your iron liqueur, add half an ounce of ferrous sulfate and half an ounce of copper sulfate to each pound of cloth. Work it for an hour in the bath, then wring it and air it and rinse it. Now take your first dye bath and add a decoction of 4 ounces of logwood liqueur to every pound of cotton, and then dye the goods in the bath until the color is exhausted. Wring out your cloth, air it, and rinse it. Now in the same dye bath, you're going to add 2 ounces of Gallipoli oil to each pound of cotton. As far as I can tell, that oil is a non-food grade olive oil that is used for lamp oil. You're going to wash and dry your cloth, and then now you are done. The oil does not add to the color, it just improves the sight and touch of the cloth itself. And because that was so intensive, that is going to be the only method of dyeing cotton black that I'm going to be mentioning here. You can go ahead and read the book if you want other methods. And that will just about wrap up this episode of One Woman is Twice Two Soldiers. Thank you so much for listening as we dived into early 19th century dyeing. I've had a lot of fun researching for this. I would look forward to doing more, potentially for more mid-19th century dyeing practices and seeing how they changed. My favorite part of natural dyeing is when people say, "Oh, I love that you do things all naturally. We need to detoxify our lives and go back to our roots." And I'm over here playing with sulfuric acid and verdigris. Nature is toxic, y'all. And just because something is natural does not mean it can't do you serious harm. Arsenic is natural. Next episode, we're going to dive into corsetry within the 19th century as discussed by those who actually wear corsets. So be on the lookout for that episode in the coming weeks. If you have any questions or comments, you can email me or find me on Instagram or YouTube under Caitlin Kearns. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of One Woman is Twice Two Soldiers. If you did, please leave a review on Spotify or YouTube and share this episode with your friends. Also, please don't hesitate to tell me which topics you'd like me to cover in future episodes. Have a fantastic week, and I'll see you back here in the next episode.